Welcome back, class, to Chaplain's College School of Ministry, the Old Testament Survey 3 class. This is the Books of the Writings. This is Lesson 6 in this particular session, and we're going to be looking at the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Take a quick look at our lesson outline. We'll see where we are here. We're getting really close to the end of this particular session. We've got this one, and then the next session we'll be looking at Ezra and Nehemiah, which will be the actual last teaching session. And we'll follow that with the review of all of our books that we've looked at during this particular time, and then the final exam will follow that. Okay, let's take a look at these books. The first called 1st and 2nd Chronicles as we know them today. A little bit of the history of them was in your text, so I'm not going to bother covering that. One thing you might, as I was looking at this, it just kind of hit me. You might kind of summarize this as, you can look at these as like the cliff notes to the Old Testament. 1st and 2nd Chronicles pretty much goes through the whole history, but it does it in an abbreviated way and with definite purpose and focus that was to meet the needs of the time. But it kind of reminds me of the old Cliff Notes things. It's just like, okay, here's the basics you need to know, but in a short form. Originally it was one book. It was divided during the time of the Septuagint, which was the Greek version of the Old Testament. And then the Latin Vulgate followed that and changed the name of it, so that's from the Latin Vulgate is where we get the actual title. This book was written during the time of the return, most likely by Ezra, who was a priest and a scribe. We'll see more about him in the next session because we're going to be looking at the book of Ezra. There are definite parallels between Chronicles and the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, that we looked at last session during our look at the prophets. This particular set, Chronicles, it focuses really just on the kingdom of Judah after the split. When the split happens, it pretty much ignores anything that happened up north. And it's basically written to encourage, for encouragement and to bring hope for the future. And it's looking to the full restoration of the glory and the coming of the ultimate king. Basically because these folks, they've just come back. It is during the time of the return. They've come back and they need some encouragement to keep going with all the tasks that they really have to do. So let's look a little bit at the background of this so we can get this in context of what's going on here. The people have come back. We've had this. The return happened in 3 waves. But as each group comes back, they're kind of hit with the reality that, this is not really a glorious return, that you might see in movies or whatever, of, like, oh, wow, people are, coming in a great grand parade and celebration, etc. Yeah, they're happy to be back. But you might liken it more to a, case of refugees returning, to their land after a war, coming back into the war zone, because Jerusalem's in shambles at this time. It's been torn down. It was destroyed 70 some odd years earlier. And it's still a royal mess. When they get back there, of course, they're still surrounded by their enemies. When Babylon and Persia, first conquered this, following their usual rule that they did whenever they conquered an area, they would take the people out of the area and move people from one of their other conquer areas into that one. Thus kind of mixing things up and helping to take a little of the fight out of the people so that they're not as likely to rise up against their rule. So you've got all these people that, the Babylonians and the Persians relocated to the surrounding area that are there that aren't particularly happy with the fact that, the Jews are now coming back into Jerusalem. And of course they don't have any of that great wealth that they had when they were looking, when they were their own nation. especially during times of David and Solomon, but even continuing on during the divided kingdom, they still had a pretty good amount of treasure. They did squander it here and there, trying to buy their way into various alliances, as we've seen, but they really have whatever the existing government will give them. And that, of course, is because they don't have their own king right now. They're still under the rule of a Persian governor. So they're back in Jerusalem, but they're not an independent nation. So another way you might look at First and Second Chronicles, if you're going to summarize it in a sentence, is how did we get here and where are we going? You look at this thing and it's it's like I said, it's kind of a cliff notes, because you got a lot of these people now. They've come back. You've had 70 years where the people have been living in a foreign land. Some of the folks have pretty much kind of forgotten what it was like, when they were in their independent nation, the glory that they had and the history. You have probably a few that remember what it was like. Some of the older folks that returned probably did remember the glory of Solomon's temple, even though it had been through a lot during the divided kingdom, but it was still a pretty magnificent structure. And then now to see the whole thing in shambles, these folks need a refresher course, basically. So they start off with the genealogy, just to kind of, how did we get here, all the way from Adam up through David, and then, continuing on into the Solomon, and then all the kings of the divided kingdom, just so that people would say, yes, this is our history, this is our tradition, this is the path that God had for our nation from the moment that we were picked out. And of course, they want to show the glory of the reigns and of David and Solomon, to remind you of how good it was when the nation followed God. The whole idea now is, okay, you've been returned. God has kept his promise. But now you have to see what you have to do to become a nation that God is going to bless again, and bring those blessings that we see here in these, especially the glory times during David and Solomon's reign. And of course, they show how the theme repeated itself even during the divided kingdom, when the kings and the people repented and returned to God. They don't have a whole lot in this Chronicles about the kings of Judah that were the evil ones, that, as we saw from the last time, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They focus mostly on the ones where there was revival occurring. Again, just to emphasize that, yes, it can be done. We need to follow God, and the good things will happen. Shows how God, got them through the exile and returned them to the land. Actually did keep the promises that he did make, which then, of course, gives them hope and confidence that God's going to keep the promises that he's made to completely restore the nation. And, of course, they have to show that people have to follow God's plan, renounce their idols, keep the laws, and worship properly in order for God's blessings to flow. With the ultimate goal, of course, being the hope that, yes, it's going to be good again, and ultimately really good when the Messiah shows up. As we mentioned, there are some parallels and some differences between 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. It covers basically the same time frame. You have a lot of the early genealogy, of course, that wasn't covered in Samuel and Kings, but that was just kind of a lead up to get to that point. A lot of the focus is on during the time of David, Solomon, and then the time of the divided kingdom, and then even during a little bit during the exile. Generally, the differences are that they leave out the bad and they emphasize the good aspect of the previous history, whereas in Samuel and Kings, You got the good, the bad, and the ugly. Definite difference in focus and the purpose between the previous books of Samuel and Kings and these books of the Chronicles. Especially you see this when they're looking at the reigns of David and Solomon. They really wanted to pump up the glory and not get too involved in any of the messy details. Like, for instance, they don't bring up that messy little thing about Bathsheba and that whole thing. No, we're just not going to mention that. And they don't get into some of Solomon's failures and his eventual turn to idols, etc. They're showing the glory because that's what they want. They want to give people hope that it can be that good again. And then when it starts looking at the divided kingdom, again, like I said, we see it focusing on the kings under whom the revival occurred, because they want to show again that, it's good when you follow God. Whereas in Samuel and Kings, the emphasis was on, hey, you guys are doing evil. You've got to come back. Kings and Samuel were really good, when there was revival and things were going good. But they also show you the bad one with the fact that they wanted to show you the warning of, like, hey guys, this is the path you're going down. There's going to be consequences. Well, now in Chronicles, those consequences have occurred. They've been exiled for 70 years and they're coming back. And so they just need to be built up and encouraged. And the emphasis basically now is on how God has kept his promises in the past. So that gives you the confidence that he's going to keep them in his promises in the future. And that's really what this whole thing's about. It's just giving people the hope and the confidence and encouraging them as they're facing these tasks that they have. Because with Jerusalem in shambles, they've got to rebuild the temple. They've got to rebuild all the infrastructure, got to rebuild the walls, and all this while being pestered by the neighbors that really aren't really happy about them being there. So they've got to have something there to remind them of the glory days, and it can be this good if you just keep the faith and keep moving on, keep on keeping on, and it'll get there. That's the whole part about this. And I was thinking about how to really kind of get this across. And I figured the best way for you to really kind of see the difference is to put you in this situation in a role-playing exercise. So this is something, in your vast amount of spare time that I know you guys have out there. There's nothing better to do than, come out and spend hours and hours and hours doing these things. But when you get a little time, just imagine yourself doing ministry during these two different periods that we've looked at here. One prior to the exile, like during the times, when we have the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And another one, you're doing your ministry after the return from the exile. And as you're thinking about this, you're doing your ministry, how would you structure your messages based on the different scenarios, the different set of circumstances, and the different focus and the different purposes that God has for what's going on during these two different times? So in the first scenario, you're operating during the time, of the events that you see of the prophets in the books of Samuel and Kings. I'm not going to put you in the role of a prophet, because I don't want to get you stuck with that 100% accuracy rule and have to worry about that. But you're doing your ministry. Let's say you're doing the motel church, out in the fringes of Jerusalem or something, or whatever. You've heard the prophets, you know what their message is, and you're out there ministering to some people. So during this time, of course, the prophets were warning the people about the consequences of their sin and reminding them of the blessing that occurred when you do follow God. Think about, what we saw the last sessions when we were looking at the prophets, how they went about it. And how would you structure your messages during this time? And then in the second scenario, now you're doing your ministry, your motel church or whatever, during the time of the return. You were part of the people that came back from exile. You've come back to Jerusalem. You see the absolute destruction that you've come back to. And you're out there working with the people. And now you're giving them messages of hope and encouragement. You need to help them see, that there is hope, to give them encouragement to rebuild what's been lost. And you got to share the vision, the promises of God for restoration and deliverance, so that they know why they've come back, and that God is going to keep these promises. It may look bleak right now, but God does keep his promises, and we have to look forward to that. So how would you structure your messages? Look that in mind. And then as you're doing this, jot down some notes about what you imagined during each of the scenarios, and then kind of reflect on it and say, okay, I can see why, Chronicles is structured the way it is as compared to the way Samuel and Kings, for instance, was structured, and the messages that the prophets gave then versus, the messages that, we did have the prophets that were during the exile and during the return. So we do have those that you can look at and kind of refer back to your notes. Then we have the folks that led the various returns. You can kind of look at them and what they had to do to keep going. Understand more, I think, just by putting yourself in the place of these people, of what you found out and how you thought about it, and any insights and revelations that you've come up with. And then in one of the future sessions, maybe we'll take a little bit of time and discuss some of the insights, the oh wow moments and the gee whiz moments, and to see what you came up with. And so that's what we have for the books of First and Second Chronicles. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this, our next one will be looking at actually the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are in this same time frame. So we'll see you then.